Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're tuned into India Tonight with me, Sumita, Kareer. And now our top story. Well, India and the United States are heading back to the negotiating table with a fresh round of talks expected soon, is what sources are suggesting. ET Now sources also say that a high-level Indian delegation is likely to visit Washington in the coming days as both sides are attempting to resolve long-pending disputes over tariffs on auto parts, steel and farm products. Remember, this is coming in at a time when US President Donald Trump is threatening a sharp escalation in tariffs from August 1, even as India continues to push for preferential treatment on its exports and protection for its domestic dairy and agriculture sectors. To discuss more on how soon could an Indian deal with the United States be arrived at, I'm now joined by a very special guest, Mr. Linscott. Mark Linscott, former assistant USTR, is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Mr. Linscott, for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. First things first, what do you make of India-US trade negotiations and where do they currently stand, given that the deadline was July 9th? Do you anticipate or expect a formal announcement soon?
Well, in fact, I've been hedging my bets a bit over the last few days on what might happen with the United States and India, because I certainly was expecting an announcement of an interim deal, at least an agreement in principle, late last week or early this week. So there's been a period of scratching our collective heads on exactly what may happen next. I think that there's been lots of progress in the negotiations. The negotiations commenced well before April 2nd, soon after Prime Minister Modi visited Washington in February. I understand that the two sides were able to hammer out a lot of specifics on tariffs, on non-tariff barriers, and pretty much conclude an interim agreement. For whatever reason, it seems that President Trump has decided not yet to announce that progress, announce an interim agreement. I think that the delegation coming back to Washington was always in the plans. This is a first phase of the negotiation on a larger bilateral trade agreement, BTA. And as each phase ends, the results are rolled up into the next phase. So I think that the delegation had long been planning to come back to Washington. In fact, since they left, the wild card is whether there will be an announcement by President Trump of an interim agreement.
Absolutely, and that's what everybody is thinking about, that whether there's going to be an announcement by President Trump in the next few days or that gets further extended till August 1. But Mr. Linscott, what's your overall reading on what could be causing this delay, given the fact that President Trump has on several occasions stated that a deal with India is happening. He says it's a very big deal, and very recently he stated that it's a good deal that's coming through, should happen soon.
You know, it's really hard to know because the President Trump, is the decision maker on all of this. He decides whether or not to conclude a deal, to announce a deal, and we were all anticipating that a deal would be announced. I don't know if it's one particular issue or whether he decided that he wanted all trading partners to be subject to this further suspension until August 1st. It's just really hard to decipher at this point in time.
Come about when this mini trade deal and that first tranche of BTA gets finalized, and what does it really mean for businesses that are based both in the United States and of course in India in terms of capitalizing on the opportunity that leaders of both the countries are attempting to present?
Well, I think the opportunities are immense. The benefits for both sides would be quite substantial. We've seen the value of trade between the two countries for both goods and services constantly increasing. It's roughly 200 billion a year now in both goods and services bilaterally. The objective by 2030 is to increase that to 500 billion. I think that's a realistic goal, but it does require the groundwork to be set for both sides to further open their markets, offer preferential access to each other, resolve some of the difficult issues. I mean, that's what this negotiation has been all about, whether it's an interim deal, whether it's the larger bilateral trade agreement, which could take at least another year or two to conclude. The intention is that it be comprehensive. It's going to be the benefit of both sides. This is a true win-win situation that we are contemplating.
Absolutely, and we do hope that it turns out to be like that. But do you think there's acceptance on the part of President Trump's administration that some sectors are strict no-go zones for India, of these no-go zones, and if there is acceptance on the part of the United States?
I don't know that there's acceptance in the long term of no-go zones. And certainly both countries have their sensitivities, and in every trade negotiation involving any country, there are always sensitivities and difficult issues, many of which that aren't resolved until the end. I think for this first phase of negotiation for an interim agreement, there is sensitivity to what you describe as no-go zones. I mean, there's been a lot of press on dairy, on wheat, some other agriculture commodities, and I think that there's some degree of appreciation of those sensitivities on the U.S. side. Now, down the road, as they roll up outcomes and make progress and begin to tackle some of the more difficult issues, maybe later this year or even into 2026, there may be a push in some of these no-go zones. Certainly in the agriculture area, certainly on e-commerce, but for the moment, I think that there is understanding on the U.S. side that not everything can be resolved at this early stage.
All right. So, Mr. Linscott, you're essentially hinting at a protracted set of conversations and negotiations that are likely to happen between both the sides. But how do you read into this extension which has come about on the deadline from July 9th to now August 1?
Well, it's not a big surprise. I think many of us were anticipating that there would be an extension of the deadline for the reciprocal tariffs for many countries. I do feel that India was in a unique position because we anticipated that there would be an announcement of an agreement that would then waive the reciprocal tariffs. But for many other countries where there's not been so much progress, it does permit more time to resolve issues. In some respects, I think President Trump sees it as more leverage for him in pushing for more concessions from other countries. I had hoped that would not be the situation with India. It may not be the situation with India if there is an announcement in coming days of an interim agreement, of a deal. But that's a hard question to answer at this point in time.
Okay, but when you say that the deal could happen soon, what do you exactly mean by soon? Is there a timeline that you're thinking of in your mind, looking at how the Trump administration really works? And of course, you're based in Washington. You're former USTR as well.
Yeah, again, this isn't lower level people making this decision. This is not necessarily Howard Lutnick or Jameson Greer or Scott Bessent making the decision on whether to announce a deal with India. This is the president himself, and that's the uncertainty. I mean, the president has always thrived on a bit of chaos, on being unpredictable, and I think we're seeing that play out right now on the trade front and with respect to this specific situation. So, I think it's very difficult for anybody. Certainly, I find it difficult to be able to assess what is going on in the president's mind, what is his calculus. But that's the dynamic we have. It's the president who's deciding when and what to announce, and that's why we have the uncertainty.
Right. Mr. Linscott, now when we come to the extension of the deadline, would you say that it's more to do with the United States, quote unquote, unilateral trading approach that some allies have mentioned? And does it really then put the United States at the risk of perhaps not striking enough deals with countries?
Well, I think that there is, well, first of all, there definitely are resource constraints. This is unprecedented. The United States, and specifically the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and its trade negotiators have never simultaneously negotiated so many agreements with so many countries all at once. So that's a real, I think, challenge for the United States. There also is the the issue of the perception of unfair trade practices, whether trade has been reciprocal with many countries. That is harder to understand with a country with which the United States runs a surplus. For example, we have a surplus of trade with Australia. So why should we be negotiating unfair trade barriers with Australia? In fact, we have a free trade agreement with Australia. It's a little hard to understand in that particular situation. But with many countries, there's long been the notion that there are trade barriers in place. The WTO has not resolved those. The WTO, in fact, has not worked in terms of equalizing tariffs between the United States and many other countries, and that's the impetus for these negotiations.
Right. Right. So, Mr. Linscott, how do you see this policy really play out in terms of how long is this process going to be for the United States to finalize deals, given that there are, thousands of tariff lines in India, for instance? I'm given to understand that there are around 17 to 18,000 tariff lines, and for negotiations to happen within a given period of time could perhaps be difficult.
Well, again, this was intended to be an interim agreement. It was what we expected to be announced, what's not happened yet, but we expected to be announced a partial deal. It was not going to be comprehensive. It was not going to cover every single sector. It was not going to cover every single tariff line, 17,000 tariff lines for India, roughly 10, 11,000 tariff lines for the United States. But I did anticipate that it would be a substantial proportion of those tariff lines. I would not be surprised if they've already reached agreement on as many as half of those tariff lines. But I don't think anybody on either side realistically expected that an agreement at this point in time, only a couple of months into the negotiation, could possibly be comprehensive and cover the entire tariff schedule. So this was intended to be, in some respects, a continuing ceasefire on reciprocal tariffs, a real win-win in terms of benefits for both sides and opening markets for both sides, and again, the harder issues to be brought onto the table at a later stage of the negotiation. But we'll see. I mean, this is, every day I am constantly updating my feeds to see if there's a deal with any country, but in particular, India. And perhaps it will be today, tomorrow. It's just, I certainly did not anticipate this situation. I think many of us trade experts and former trade negotiators didn't anticipate this situation.
None of us anticipated this situation either, Mr. Linscott. But when you see the pushback that's coming by countries like Japan, Brazil now, and of course China, how do you anticipate that the United States is going to respond to that pushback that's coming in from countries?
Well, the worst case scenario is that the United States and the Trump administration does, in fact, not provide any further suspension of reciprocal tariffs. It moves forward with imposition of tariffs. It also moves forward with imposition of sectoral tariffs under the so-called Section 232 reviews. I think that's a worst case scenario. It's it's possible that some countries feel that it's no longer in their interest to continue negotiating with the United States. It's not clear what more they can offer. It's not clear what are the costs of or even benefits of reaching a deal with the United States, particularly if it might be a circumstance in which they reach a deal, yet 2 weeks later, new tariffs are applied as sectoral ones under Section 232. So there is that risk that some countries, and you highlight Japan, I think Korea is in this kind of situation. What more can they offer? How far can they go in avoiding these reciprocal tariffs? And ultimately, is it in their benefit to strike agreements with the United States, particularly if they can't be certain of the sanctity of an agreement once that's reached? I think that's a real problem of credibility
Absolutely.
for the Trump administration.
Right. Absolutely. And it remains to be seen whether the United States is going to stick to its stance. But one final question, Mr. Linscott, before we let you go, which is essentially about the fact that can the United States sustain its stance on such high tariffs? For example, 50% proposal that President Trump has given for for tariffs on copper and 50% on Brazil without actually accelerating inflationary and growth concerns?
Well, that's the biggest question in many respects. We've already had circumstances of alliances, long-standing alliances being negatively impacted by the reciprocal tariffs and the threats, and some of the commentary from the president about being treated unfairly. I don't think that has been useful for the United States. But if we actually do have tariffs that are imposed, and that has impacts on the U.S. economy, the markets tank, consumers find that the prices of goods on the shelves in the grocery stores are increasing. I think that is a circumstance that will probably occasion some real soul searching about whether this trade policy is working and whether it needs to be adjusted to ensure that there are not some serious political costs for the administration. So I think that is the ultimate risk that this administration is facing. If we see inflation go up, if we see markets tank, that will be hugely problematic for the administration.
Absolutely, Mr. Linscott. And in fact, the extension of the deadline, the 90-day tariff deadline, came on the back of concerns around some of those factors. But thank you very much once again for taking the time out and joining us on this broadcast live.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.